All right, well, here's some thoughts. I spent some time trying to collect them, and maybe they're collected a little bit. But there's a couple different, trains of thought. One is, what would my perspective be as a juror? That's my simulation of, well, what should the law do at this point? Right, like if certain evidence that wasn't before the court, the jurors shouldn't take that into account. Theoretically, they don't know about it, but if they're fibbing or they have a memory of some evidence that, wasn't presented to them, they should disregard it. On the other hand, besides there being my opinion about the case and the law and what the law is, there's what the law should be. What does manslaughter, really mean? You know, uh, there's these ideas like crime of passion, manslaughter. How you get into a fight. Like a typical example of manslaughter to me is you get in a bar fight and one guy kills the other guy. That's not okay, right? Um, but for whatever reason, we discriminate that from getting in a bar fight, not killing a guy, and then tracking him down later that night to kill him, right? Versus plotting for weeks and months to kill somebody. Okay, so there's opinions on all that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's commentary on how I think the lawyers did, or for that matter, any of the witnesses, what their impact was. And there's this issue of people that are like, "Oh, get your own life. Why do you care about this?" Well, I was trying to think because I was telling people that I follow court cases every couple years. I can't remember when I followed this closely since OJ. But I do sort of follow them, but to actually watch the court proceedings, well, they're not all broadcast, and I don't have a general interest in following court cases. I mean, basically, I have to get interested while it's a reported or alleged crime as it's developing. I heard about the Zimmerman thing before he'd been arrested, so it became of interest to see how it all turned out. And you can only really know that if you follow the details. And so that's this final question about the Fourth Estate. I've been watching a lot more Fox, CNN, and Headline News than I ever do. I don't watch them hardly at all now, normally. And I've been watching it. It's like people like George Taffy, and they're on show after show. I mean, they're there at CNN and HLN doing every show for 4 or 5 hours, which they then repeat throughout the day. TV's gotten weird. Okay, the internet's way better way to get news and entertainment. But anyway, so there's all of these issues, I mean, probably the idiocy of the talking heads is there's one or two that know what they're talking about, and a lot of them have no idea what they're talking about, and some of them know what they're talking about in general, but aren't really watching. They're not like watching the court case all day. They're just coming and being a talking head for a couple hours, and they base their opinions on the highlights that the other talking heads that have done through the day. And then there's a couple, like street reporters that are actually in the courthouse all day, and they're going, this person cried, and that person, and they looked interested. Very little of value. Now, when you notice that, that's why if you do take an interest in a case like this, don't fool yourself. You can't just keep up with it on the evening news or the paper. If you really take interest in a case, you're going to have to look at the evidence and even follow which stuff got in front of the jury and learn a little bit about why and have an opinion about if that makes sense, what was allowed and what wasn't. Understand some of the compromises and make, this, like I'm saying, this 5-dimensional judgment of everybody, including myself, right? Because when I'm thinking, well, what if I was a juror? I have to go, well, what if I was a juror? That's different than just vlogging about it. Because if you're a juror, like if we went in if I was a juror and we were to to do our first round. They had 3 hours of deliberation today. So let's pretend they took a quick vote. I'd be like, well, I see manslaughter. I would like to talk about murder too. On the other hand, we're all 6 equals here. We're supposed to try to find a unanimous decision. And if somebody thinks not guilty is the way to go, I'm open to that. If somebody can show me a credible way that's possible. And if I have 4 ways it could have happened where George is guilty and 1 that is credible where he's not, our system says let that guy go as protection against jailing innocent people. Right? Which requires some self-reflection. Could I actually do that? And yeah, I could if somebody could present that story, but I don't see how that's possible. The contradictions in George's story, well, John Guy did a very good, is that his name? John Guy? Yeah. Did a very good job. He brought out all the points I wanted, not exactly, but then again, he actually had one that was better. I've been wondering, maybe they were 5, and I still think it's possible that the whole period of that scream, whether it was George or not, they were fighting over the gun. That would make sense why there weren't so many more scratches or bruises on either one of them than there were. They're wrestling, holding about the gun. But John Guy made a good point. It's like, how did George shoot him straight in there if they're fighting over the gun? That would be amazing to get it right, because when you're fighting over a gun, maybe you get hit in the head, but to actually get it. And he pointed out a lot of the inconsistencies and stuff that I wanted to see pointed out. I still think they should have done more about the 40 feet distance between the dead body and the supposed start. And as a juror, I'd look at the spread of evidence. Obviously they ran around. And I think I would do a couple things. One, who was screaming? Well, you don't know. So you don't take it into account. It doesn't matter. Oh, but it would be so important if you did know. So of course it matters. Yeah, but you can't know, so it can't matter in your reasoning. Maybe when you're done with your reasoning and figured out for other reasons that it was this or that person, maybe it'll give you a hint who was screaming. But it's not something you're going to be able to use, so you discount that. Similarly, Zimmerman has changed in his story and lied, circling the car, where he first saw Trayvon, on, and I think that includes following Trayvon or not. But that doesn't mean he's guilty. So again, you just discount his version of the story. You bring it back in later to compare with the story that you come up with using just the other witnesses, right? And that story is that 2 guys started arguing just south of the T, right? Which tells me that George went at least a little way south of the T. And there was some sort of scrabble that spread out between all the evidence for 40 feet. Doesn't mean that they touched each other that whole 40 feet. Maybe George saw Trayvon and dropped his flashlight. Maybe George took his key flashlight back and dropped it there before to say he'd never gone down south. And I think you just subtract most of those, except for that that it had to do with going into the T from the top, at least down to where the phone was, and which was by the dead body, Trayvon's dead body. Okay, that does not comport with George's story. Okay, and one thing I would have done that the prosecution didn't do is I would have tried to incorporate John Good's story into the big narrative. I think I would have presented a big narrative, but I'm no lawyer, but I think they did miss on the big narrative. To me, it seems clear that, in the narrative that I understand is that George did follow him south of the T. They started arguing. They started struggling. There's no bruises. There's only one little scratch on Trayvon. There's no scratches. There's not enough evidence for 2 minutes of punching without answer. what it looks like is a grabby fight. And as I said, I would have presented that grabbing is either over the gun or over Zimmerman trying to restrain Trayvon, and not in the intelligent way. Trayvon says, "What you following me for?" And George should say, "Well, because I don't know who you are. Where do you live? The police are on their way." George doesn't claim to have done that. George doesn't admit to have run around over a 40-foot length back and forth or any of that. I think that the prosecution touched on things necessary for murder too. The ill will, basically, of he didn't want these assholes to get away. You know, he thought of Trayvon as somebody he'd seen before. That always gets away. But I don't think the prosecution did a great job of showing that. But I do think that in the end, they did a great job of arguing for that and showing that it's at least manslaughter. Because in manslaughter, you just think, did George take reasonable precautions? Were his reaction proportional and reasonable? And they weren't. So my prediction, and it's just a prediction, I'm usually wrong in these kinds of things, but I like to try to predict, so, is that it'll come back manslaughter tomorrow or Monday.